The limestone gates stood 30 feet high, crowned with iron eagles whose wings had long since rusted into permanent flight. Beyond them stretched a driveway that wound through 2 miles of manicured wilderness, past fountains that once shot water 60 feet into the air, past gardens designed by men who had studied at Versailles, past stables that housed horses worth more than most American homes. This was Lynnewood Hall, and in its prime, it was not merely a mansion. It was a monument to everything America had become in the Gilded Age, a cathedral built not to worship God but to worship wealth itself, and like all false idols, it would eventually crumble. But the story of how it came to be, and how it fell, is far darker than the simple tale of architectural decay. It is a story written in blood and cold dust, in the broken bodies of children who worked in mines, in the desperation of families torn apart by industrial greed. It is the story of Peter Arrell Browne Widener, a man who built the largest mansion America would ever lose, and the empire of suffering upon which it stood. Welcome to the dark estate, where we uncover the shadows behind history's grandest facades. If you're drawn to the hidden darkness of forgotten empires, the untold stories of power and corruption, then you're in the right place. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Drop a like on this video if you're ready to descend into this tale of greed and ruin, and comment below with your thoughts as we journey together through this mansion's dark past. Your support keeps these stories alive, so thank you for being here. Now, let's step through those rusted gates and into a world where wealth was built on the backs of the broken. The year was 1834, and Philadelphia was transforming. The city that had birthed American independence was now giving birth to something else entirely. Something that the Founding Fathers had not anticipated when they penned their declarations of equality and justice. It was giving birth to industrial aristocracy, to a new kind of nobility that would make the old European houses of title look almost quaint by comparison. Into this world came Peter Arrell Browne Widener, born not into wealth but into the middle class, the son of a brickmaker who understood the value of hard work but could never have imagined the scale of fortune his son would accumulate. Young Peter grew up watching Philadelphia expand, watching the streets fill with immigrants desperate for work, watching factory smoke begin to stain the sky, and somewhere in that watching, he learned the fundamental lesson that would shape his life. He learned that in America, you did not need to be born into power, you simply needed to be willing to take it, no matter the cost. Widener's first fortune came from meat. During the Civil War, while young men bled and died in fields across the South, Widener secured contracts to supply mutton to the Union Army. There was nothing noble about this work, nothing heroic. It was simply business, the kind of business that thrived on tragedy, that grew fat on the machinery of war. He understood something that many of his contemporaries did not. War was not an interruption of commerce. It was an opportunity, perhaps the greatest opportunity, because in war, government spent without counting, and men who could supply what armies needed could name their price. The mutton contract made Widener wealthy, but it was only the beginning. He took that wealth and he did what all ambitious men of his era did. He looked at the changing landscape of American cities and he saw transportation. The streetcar revolution was transforming urban America. Cities that had once been compact and walkable were sprawling outward, and people needed ways to move through these expanding metropolitan landscapes. Horse-drawn streetcars were giving way to mechanized systems, and whoever controlled those systems would control the flow of urban life itself. Widener saw this, and more importantly, he saw how to monopolize it. He began acquiring streetcar lines in Philadelphia, but acquisition was not enough. He needed to own not just the cars but the very infrastructure they ran on. The rails themselves, the depots, the maintenance facilities, everything. And he needed to eliminate competition, not through better service or lower prices, but through political manipulation and strategic ruthlessness. This was where Widener truly distinguished himself from ordinary businessmen. He understood that in the Gilded Age, the greatest fortunes were not made by competing in free markets but by capturing regulatory systems and using government power to create monopolies. He cultivated relationships with Philadelphia's political machine, with the ward bosses and city councilmen who controlled permits and franchises. He made generous contributions to political campaigns, not out of civic duty but as investments that paid dividends in favorable legislation. When rival streetcar companies sought to expand their routes, Widener's political allies on the city council voted them down. When Widener wanted to raise fares or reduce service on unprofitable lines, those same allies approved the changes without question. The system was not corrupt in the traditional sense, or rather, it was so thoroughly corrupt that it had become the system itself, and Widener was its architect. But streetcars in Philadelphia were merely the foundation. Widener's true genius, if we can use such a word for what he did, lay in understanding that local monopolies could be combined into regional empires, and that regional empires could be leveraged into national power. He formed partnerships with other transportation magnates, men like William Elkins and Thomas Dolan, creating a syndicate that controlled streetcar systems not just in Philadelphia but in Chicago, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, and New York. They formed holding companies that owned holding companies. creating corporate structures so complex that even experienced investigators could not trace the ownership chains. And at the center of this web sat Widener, collecting profits from millions of Americans who had no choice but to pay his fares if they wanted to get to work, to go home, to move through the cities that were supposed to belong to everyone but increasingly belonged only to men like him. The working conditions for streetcar employees were abhorrent. Drivers worked 16-hour shifts in all weather, standing exposed to summer heat and winter cold, operating vehicles through crowded streets where accidents were common and safety measures were non-existent. They were paid by the mile, not by the hour, which meant they had to drive recklessly to make anything close to a living wage. When they organized unions and demanded better treatment, Widener crushed the strikes with imported strikebreakers and private security forces. When workers were injured on the job, the company lawyers argued that the employees had assumed the risk by taking the work, and court after court agreed, because the judges too were part of the system, because everyone who mattered had been paid or persuaded or placed into position by men like Widener. But transportation was still not enough. Widener looked at the industrial landscape and saw energy, saw coal, saw the black rock that powered everything from locomotives to factory furnaces, and he saw that controlling energy meant controlling industrial civilization itself. He invested heavily in Pennsylvania coal mines, but here his method was different. He did not want to own the mines directly, did not want his name associated with the brutal work of extraction. Instead, he purchased controlling interests in mining companies through intermediaries, through corporate shells that kept his involvement obscured. This was strategic not just for business reasons but for social ones. Widener had aspirations to high society, to acceptance among the old Philadelphia families. And while those families were happy to profit from industrial exploitation, they preferred not to have their hands visibly dirty. The coal mines of Pennsylvania were hell on earth. Men descended into darkness every day knowing they might never emerge. Cave-ins were common, explosions more common still. Black lung disease slowly suffocated workers over years and decades, turning their lungs into useless masses of scarred tissue. And then there were the children, because yes, children worked in these mines. Boys as young as 8 years old, employed as breaker boys, sitting in enormous rooms where coal was crushed and sorted, picking slate from the moving river of black rock for 10 or 12 hours a day, their small fingers cut and bleeding, their bodies bent prematurely by the unnatural posture required for the work. These children breathed coal dust until their lungs were as black as the coal itself, and many of them never reached adulthood, dying of respiratory diseases or industrial accidents before they turned 20. Widener knew about these conditions. It was impossible not to know. There were investigations, newspaper exposes, testimonies before legislative committees. Reformers presented photographic evidence of child laborers, showed their maimed hands and stunted bodies. And what did Widener do? He hired public relations experts to argue that the mines provided employment to families who would otherwise starve. He funded studies that claimed coal dust was actually beneficial for the lungs, that it prevented tuberculosis. He contributed to politicians who opposed child labor restrictions, arguing that such regulations would destroy the competitiveness of American industry. And he built his mansion, room by room, dollar by dollar. Each stone and tile and piece of gilding purchased with money, extracted from the suffering of men and women and children who had no choice but to descend into his darkness. By the 1890s, Widener was one of the wealthiest men in America, with a fortune estimated at over $100 million, equivalent to billions in today's currency. And he decided it was time to build something that would declare his status to the world, something that would dwarf even the extravagant mansions of the Vanderbilts and Astors, something that would stand as permanent proof that Peter Widener had not just succeeded in America but had conquered it. He purchased a vast estate in Elkins Park, just outside Philadelphia, 270 acres of rolling hills and mature forests, and there, between 1897 and 1900, he constructed Lynnewood Hall. The architect was Horace Trumbull, a Philadelphia designer who would go on to create many of the Gilded Age's most extravagant estates. But Lynnewood Hall was Trumbull's masterwork, the project that established his reputation and demonstrated what could be achieved when money was genuinely no object. The mansion would contain 110 rooms spread across 70,000 square feet. To put that in perspective, the average American home of that era was perhaps 1,200 square feet. Lynnewood Hall was 58 times larger than the houses most Americans lived in, and it was designed for a family of just 4 people plus whatever army of servants was required to maintain such an absurdity. The main facade stretched for 280 feet, a horizontal palace that seemed to go on forever, built from Indiana limestone that had been selected block by block to ensure perfect color matching. The entrance portico featured columns that had been carved from single pieces of marble, each weighing several tons and requiring custom-built equipment to install. The front doors were bronze, cast in Paris and shipped across the Atlantic, depicting classical scenes of triumph and conquest that left no doubt about how Widener saw himself. Stepping through those doors meant entering a world that had been designed to overwhelm, to make visitors feel small and insignificant. In the presence of Widener's accumulated power, the entrance hall rose 3 stories. a vast vertical space topped by a stained glass skylight that cast colored light across marble floors imported from Italian quarries. The marble had been selected personally by Widener during a European tour, chosen not for its beauty alone but for its rarity, for the fact that the particular quarry had been exhausted and no one else could ever have floors quite like his. The walls were paneled in Santo Domingo mahogany, each panel hand-carved with motifs copied from French palaces. The staircase was constructed from carved marble, rising in a grand curve to the upper floors, wide enough that 10 people could walk abreast, though in practice it was used primarily by Widener himself and occasionally by guests who were being given tours of his magnificence. To the right of the entrance hall lay the art gallery, because of course there was an art gallery. Widener had become one of America's most prolific art collectors, purchasing paintings and sculptures with the same aggressive appetite he had brought to acquiring streetcar lines and coal mines. His collection eventually included works by Rembrandt and Vermeer, by Raphael and Van Dyck, masterpieces that had been created by men of genius and were now owned by a man whose genius was for exploitation. The gallery at Lynnewood Hall was designed specifically to display this collection, with walls covered in silk damask and lighting systems that were revolutionary for their time, allowing the paintings to be illuminated properly even at night. But here is where the darkness of the story deepens. Because Widener's art collection was not just about personal enjoyment or even about status, it was about laundering his reputation, about transforming money that had been made through the suffering of workers into something that seemed refined and cultured. When people saw the Widener collection, they were supposed to think of beauty and civilization, not of children dying in coal mines. The art was a kind of moral alchemy, turning the base metal of industrial exploitation into the gold of cultural achievement. And it worked, at least for a while. Widener was praised as a patron of the arts, as a man of taste and refinement, and the fact that his taste had been purchased with blood money was politely ignored by the critics and curators who benefited from his patronage. The library at Lynnewood Hall was another monument to this attempted transformation. It housed over 60,000 volumes, rare books and manuscripts that Widener had acquired from estates and auction houses across Europe. Many of these books had never been read by Widener himself, would never be read by him, because he was not actually a scholar or an intellectual. He was a collector, which is a different thing entirely. The library was about possession, about being able to say that he owned things that others could not have. Among the volumes were medieval illuminated manuscripts, first editions of scientific treatises, personal correspondence from historical figures. Each item had a story, had come from somewhere and meant something. But at Lynnewood Hall, these stories were subsumed into the larger story of Widener's wealth. The dining room could seat 40 guests at a single table, a piece of furniture so massive that it had to be assembled inside the room because it could not fit through any door. The walls were covered in Flemish tapestries that dated back to the 16th century, woven representations of hunting scenes and courtly life, images of a European aristocracy that Widener was consciously imitating even though his own wealth was far newer and far more brutally acquired. The ceiling was coffered and gilded, the pattern copied from an Italian palazzo, and suspended from it hung chandeliers of Waterford crystal that contained over 500 individual pieces of cut glass each. Dinner at Lynnewood Hall was a performance, a ritual demonstration of excess where meals of 12 or 15 courses were served by liveried footmen while musicians played from a concealed gallery. The ballroom occupied the entire third floor of one wing, a space large enough to accommodate several hundred guests for the elaborate parties that Widener hosted. The floor was parquetry, different woods arranged in intricate geometric patterns, polished to such a high shine that it reflected the dancers like a mirror. The walls were covered in silk panels hand-painted with pastoral scenes, French countrysides where shepherds and shepherdesses danced in eternal spring, a stark contrast to the actual countryside of Pennsylvania where Widener's coal mines scarred the landscape. At one end of the ballroom stood a pipe organ, installed at enormous expense, though Widener himself did not play and had to hire organists for his parties. The instrument was there because grand mansions were supposed to have organs, because it was one more thing to catalog in the mental list of luxuries that defined the highest tier of American society. The bedrooms numbered over 40. Though the Widener family consisted of only 4 people plus servants, many of these rooms were never used except when hosting guests, and even then, many stood empty. But they existed because the scale was the point. Because having more rooms than you could possibly use was itself a form of wealth display. The master bedroom suite occupied an entire wing of the second floor, with separate chambers for Peter and his wife Hannah, each the size of a normal family's entire home. These rooms had fireplaces carved from Italian marble, wood paneling imported from French chateaux, ceilings decorated with painted scenes from classical mythology. Each bedroom had its own full bathroom, which in 1900 was still an extraordinary luxury, fitted with fixtures of solid silver and marble tubs, carved from single blocks of stone. The servants' quarters told a different story. They were located in the basement and the top floor, deliberately separated from the family spaces. The rooms were small and spartanly furnished, with none of the luxury that characterized the rest of the house. Servants used back staircases and hallways that allowed them to move through the mansion without being seen by the family or guests, because the machinery that kept Lynnewood Hall functioning was supposed to be invisible. At its peak, the house employed a staff of over 60 people: maids and footmen and cooks and gardeners and stable hands and laundresses and maintenance workers. These people were paid poorly, expected to work long hours, and lived their lives in service to a family whose wealth they had no share in creating. The grounds of Lynnewood Hall were as extravagant as the house itself. Formal gardens extended in every direction, laid out in geometric patterns inspired by Versailles, with fountains and reflecting pools and sculptures imported from Europe. There was a greenhouse complex that covered over an acre, climate-controlled spaces where tropical plants could be grown year-round in the Pennsylvania cold, where Widener could have orchids and palms and exotic flowers no matter the season outside. The stable complex housed dozens of horses, each one worth more than a worker would earn in years, tended by grooms who slept in apartments above the stalls. There was a garage for automobiles, a relatively new technology that Widener embraced with typical excess, acquiring multiple vehicles even though paved roads were still rare and driving was more a hobby than practical transportation. But Lynnewood Hall was not just a house, it was a fortress of privilege, a physical manifestation of the distance between the very rich and everyone else in Gilded Age America. The estate was surrounded by walls and gates, guarded by private security, accessible only to those who had been explicitly invited or who worked there. This was necessary, Widener believed, because the working class was dangerous, prone to violence and radicalism, needing to be kept at bay. He never seemed to grasp that the reason workers might be angry, might be radical, was because men like him had created a system where they worked themselves to death while he lived in a palace built with their exploitation. The cost of constructing Lynnewood Hall was never publicly disclosed, but estimates put it somewhere between $8 and $10 million. Equivalent to well over $200 million in today's currency, and this was just the construction cost. The furnishings, the art collection, the books, the ongoing operational expenses, these pushed the total investment far higher. To put this in context, in 1900, the average American worker earned about $500 per year. Widener spent on his mansion the equivalent of 20,000 workers' annual salaries, or to frame it differently, a single worker would have had to labor for 20,000 years, without spending anything, to afford what Widener built in 3 years. This obscene disparity was not lost on everyone. There were critics, journalists and reformers who pointed out the injustice of such extreme concentration of wealth. The progressive movement was beginning to gain strength, pushing for labor reforms, for trust, for graduated income taxes that would redistribute at least some of the wealth that men like Widener had accumulated. But Widener and his fellow plutocrats fought these reforms at every turn, pouring money into political campaigns, funding think tanks and university departments that would produce research supporting their interests, using their newspapers to shape public opinion. They argued that their wealth was earned, that they were job creators, that interfering with their fortunes would destroy American prosperity. And enough people believed them, or at least enough politicians did, that the system continued largely unchanged. Widener's family life at Lynnewood Hall was complicated by tragedy in ways that money could not prevent. His daughter Eleanor married and moved out, but his son George developed into a man very much in his father's image, becoming a businessman and art collector in his own right. George married Eleanor Elkins, daughter of Widener's business partner William Elkins, creating a dynasty merger that consolidated even more wealth and power. George and Eleanor had 3 children, Harry, George, and Eleanor, and the youngest, George, called Georgie, was his grandfather's favorite, a boy being groomed to inherit not just wealth but the Widener approach to the world. But in April of 1912, something happened that would shake the family in ways that all their money could not protect against. George Widener, his wife Eleanor, and their son Harry were returning from a European tour aboard the RMS Titanic. They had been traveling in first class, naturally, staying in some of the ship's finest accommodations, dining with other members of the American and European elite. On the night of April 14th, the ship struck an iceberg and began to sink. In the chaos and horror that followed, Eleanor Widener managed to get into a lifeboat and survived. But George and Harry went down with the ship. Their bodies never recovered from the cold Atlantic waters. Peter Widener was 78 years old when he learned that his son and grandson had died. The telegram arrived at Lynnewood Hall, and the old man who had been so ruthless in business, who had crushed strikes and fought unions and built his fortune on the suffering of workers, was suddenly confronted with a tragedy that his money could not fix. No amount of wealth could bring his son back. No political connections could recover his grandson's body from the ocean floor. For perhaps the first time in his life, Peter Widener was powerless, and the mansion that had been built to demonstrate his mastery over the world suddenly felt like a mausoleum. Eleanor Widener, the daughter-in-law who survived, became obsessed with memorializing her dead husband and son. She donated $3.5 million to Harvard University to build the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library, one of the largest academic libraries in the world, dedicated to the memory of her son who had been an avid book collector. The library opened in 1915 and still stands today. a monument to a young man who died before he could achieve whatever he might have achieved. But there is a bitter irony in this memorial, because the money that built it came from the same source as the money that built Lynnewood Hall. It came from streetcar fares extracted from working families, from coal mined by children who never had the opportunity to learn to read, let alone collect rare books. Harry Widener's library was built on the broken bodies of people who could never have accessed its collections. Peter Widener lived for 3 more years after the Titanic disaster. Dying in November of 1915 at the age of 8, he spent those final years at Lynnewood Hall, increasingly isolated, surrounded by his art and books and luxuries, but unable to escape the knowledge that death comes for everyone, regardless of wealth. When he died, his estate was valued at over $100 million, making him one of the richest men in American history. But he died having created nothing of lasting value except his mansion and his art collection. He had built no institutions that served the public good, founded no universities, established no hospitals. He had simply accumulated wealth and spent it on himself, and when he was gone, that was his legacy. Exploitation and excess. Nothing more. His will divided his fortune among his surviving children and grandchildren, but also included provisions for his art collection. Much of it was bequeathed to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., where it forms the core of that institution's European painting collection. This is where the moral alchemy finally seemed to work. Because today people visit the National Gallery and admire the Widener collection and think of art and beauty, and almost no one thinks about the coal miners and streetcar workers whose suffering paid for those paintings. The art has been laundered through the generations, its origins obscured, its provenance sanitized. The paintings hang on museum walls and they are beautiful and important and significant, and almost no one asks where they really came from. After Peter Widener's death, Lynnewood Hall passed to his son Joseph, who had little interest in maintaining such an enormous property. Joseph and his family lived there only intermittently, preferring to travel and spend time at other properties. The army of servants was gradually reduced. The maintenance became less meticulous, the gardens less perfectly tended. During the 1920s, the house was still occasionally used for large social gatherings, but the era of Gilded Age excess was ending. The progressive movement had achieved some of its goals. Income taxes had been established, labor unions had gained legal protections, child labor was being restricted, the social conditions that had made fortunes like Widener's possible were changing, and the mansions that symbolized that era were beginning to feel like anachronisms. Joseph Widener died in 1943, and the house passed to his heirs. But by then World War II had transformed America's priorities and sensibilities. The extravagance that Lynnewood Hall represented seemed not just excessive but actively offensive in an era of rationing and sacrifice. The family tried to maintain the property, but the costs were astronomical. The heating bills alone ran to tens of thousands of dollars per year. The property taxes were enormous, and the maintenance required constant attention and expense. In 1948, the family made the decision to sell the art collection that still remained in the house, auctioning it off through galleries in New York. The auction raised millions of dollars, but it also marked the beginning of the end for Lynnewood Hall as anything other than an enormous empty building. In the 1950s, various proposals were made for the property. There was talk of converting it into a museum or a hotel, of donating it to a university or cultural institution, but no plan came to fruition. The house was simply too large, too expensive to maintain, too specifically designed for the lifestyle of extreme wealth that no longer existed in quite the same form. In 1952, the contents of the house, everything that had not been sold or given away, were auctioned off. The furniture, the fixtures, the remaining art and books, everything was sold piece by piece, dispersing the accumulated treasures of Lynnewood Hall to dealers and collectors across the country. The house stood empty, its rooms stripped bare, the only thing remaining being the building itself. For decades, Lynnewood Hall languished in this state of abandonment. Various owners purchased the property with plans to develop or restore it, but each plan fell through. The house was too expensive to restore, too large for practical use, too historically significant to demolish, but not significant enough for preservation funding. It existed in a kind of limbo, gradually deteriorating as weather and time took their toll. The roof began to leak, water damage spreading through the upper floors. Vandals broke in and stole whatever metal they could find. Copper pipes and brass fixtures, anything that could be sold for scrap. The once pristine facade became stained and weathered, limestone crumbling in places, windows broken and boarded up. In 19, the property was purchased by the First Korean Church of New York, which had plans to convert it into a church and community center. They invested millions of dollars in stabilization and basic repairs, replacing the roof and addressing some of the water damage. But the full restoration they envisioned never materialized. The costs were too high, the technical challenges too complex. The church still owns the property as of this writing, but Lynnewood Hall remains largely empty and unused, a massive shell of what it once was. Today, Lynnewood Hall is often cited as America's largest forgotten mansion, sometimes called the most endangered historic property in the nation. preservationists have fought to get it listed on the National Register of Historic Places, to secure funding for restoration, to find some use for the building that would preserve it for future generations. But the fundamental problem remains: the house was designed for a way of life that no longer exists, for a concentration of wealth so extreme that it could be spent on purely personal luxury. Modern society has no equivalent use for such a structure. It is too large for a family home, too expensive for a museum, too specialized for conversion to other purposes. It stands as a monument to an era, but it is a monument that no one quite knows what to do with. Walking through Lynnewood Hall today, if you could gain access, which is difficult because the property is private and dangerous, you would see the ruins of magnificence. The marble floors are still there, though damaged by water and neglect. The patterns still visible but stained and cracked. The mahogany paneling remains on some walls, though much has been stripped away by thieves or damaged by moisture. The grand staircase still rises through the center of the house, though the carpet that once covered it is long gone and the marble treads are chipped and broken in places. The ballroom is empty, its painted silk wall panels faded and torn, its parquet floor warped and discolored. The art gallery stands vacant. The walls that once held masterpieces now holding only the memory of them in the servants' quarters. The small rooms are even more deteriorated, because they were built with less durable materials to begin with and have received even less attention during the years of abandonment. The back staircases are treacherous, wood-rotted in places, railings missing. The basement is flooded in some areas. The mechanical systems that once kept the house functioning now rusted ruins. Outside, the gardens have become wilderness, the geometric patterns erased by decades of growth. Fountains dry and clogged with debris, sculptures toppled or stolen. The greenhouse complex collapsed an overgrown dot. But the story of Lynnewood Hall is not just the story of one mansion's decay. It is the story of an entire system, an entire approach to wealth and power that built monuments to itself and then could not sustain them. The Gilded Age produced dozens of mansions like Lynnewood Hall, palaces built by men who had made fortunes in railroads and steel and coal and banking. And most of those mansions are gone now, demolished or converted or abandoned. The Vanderbilt houses on Fifth Avenue were torn down to make room for apartment buildings and office towers. The Astor mansions were replaced by hotels and skyscrapers. The great estates that once surrounded America's cities have been subdivided and developed, turned into suburbs and shopping centers. This destruction happened for several reasons. First, the maintenance costs became unsupportable as the fortunes that built these houses were divided among heirs and reduced by taxes and economic changes. Second, the cultural context that gave these houses meaning disappeared as American society became less deferential to extreme wealth and more democratic in its values. Third, the practical utility of such houses vanished as the servant class that had made them functional declined. As modern families wanted homes they could manage themselves rather than estates that required armies of workers. And fourth, the land these houses sat on became far more valuable than the houses themselves, especially in urban and suburban areas where development pressure was intense. But there is a deeper reason for the disappearance of these Gilded Age mansions, one that goes beyond economics and practicality. These houses were built on a moral framework that American society eventually, partially, rejected. They were built with the assumption that extreme concentration of wealth was natural and good, that the men who accumulated such fortunes deserved them because they were superior in ability and character, that the workers who labored for them should be grateful for the opportunity to contribute to such greatness. This framework was always false, always a self-serving justification for exploitation, but it was widely accepted during the Gilded Age. Over the 20th century, through labor organizing and progressive legislation and changing social values, America moved at least somewhat away from this framework. We developed inheritance taxes and estate taxes, specifically designed to prevent the kind of dynastic wealth concentration that men like Widener represented. We established minimum wage laws and workplace safety regulations and collective bargaining rights to give workers at least some protection against unlimited exploitation. We created social insurance programs to provide basic security to people when they were too old or sick to work. These reforms were incomplete and imperfect, fought at every step by the wealthy and their political allies, but they represented a fundamental shift in how American society thought about wealth and power. And in this context, the great mansions of the Gilded Age became embarrassments, reminders of a system that we had at least partially rejected. They could not simply be celebrated as architectural achievements because everyone knew how they had been built and what they represented. The blood of workers was in their foundations. The desperation of exploited families was in their walls. Some were preserved as museums, carefully contextualized with information about the social conditions of their era, but many others were allowed to decay or were deliberately demolished because no one wanted to maintain monuments to exploitation. Lynnewood Hall's particular tragedy is that it has lasted long enough to be historically significant but not long enough to be truly ancient. If it were a medieval castle or a Renaissance palace, its preservation would be taken for granted because its origins would be distant enough to be merely historical. But Lynnewood Hall was built within living memory of some still alive today, built in an era that we still study and debate and try to understand. The questions it raises are still relevant. How much wealth concentration is acceptable? What obligations do the wealthy have to the society that enabled their fortunes? How should we memorialize or preserve the physical remains of eras we morally reject? These questions have become particularly urgent in recent decades as wealth concentration in America has returned. Two levels not seen since the Gilded Age. The richest Americans today control a larger share of national wealth than they have at any time since the 1920s. Corporate profits have soared while worker wages have stagnated. The ratio of CEO pay to average worker pay has expanded to levels that would have shocked even the robber barons of the Gilded Age. And once again, we are seeing the construction of enormous mansions, contemporary palaces built by tech billionaires and hedge fund managers, houses of 50 or 70 or 100,000 square feet, monuments to personal wealth that seem to have learned nothing from history. The defenders of this new Gilded Age make the same arguments that Widener and his contemporaries made. They claim that wealth is earned through superior ability and hard work, that the wealthy are job creators who deserve their fortunes, that interfering with wealth accumulation would harm economic growth and prosperity. They fund think tanks and political campaigns and media outlets that spread these arguments. They fight against progressive taxation and labor organizing and financial regulation. And they build their houses. Not quite as flamboyant as Lynnewood Hall because conspicuous consumption is less culturally acceptable now, but enormous nonetheless, compounds that require staffs of workers to maintain, that consume resources at rates hundreds of times that of normal families. And someday, probably, these houses too will be abandoned. The fortunes that built them will be divided or depleted or taxed away. The cultural context that gives them meaning will shift again. The practical impossibility of maintaining such enormous properties will become apparent to their owners or heirs, and they will stand empty, slowly deteriorating, and people will walk through them and wonder what kind of society produced such excess, what kind of moral framework allowed such concentration of wealth while others struggled to survive. The story of Peter Widener and Lynnewood Hall is often told as a tale of architectural loss, a lament for a magnificent building that is disappearing. And there is genuine loss there, because Horace Trumbauer was a talented architect and Lynnewood Hall was an impressive achievement of design and construction. The craftsmanship that went into the building was extraordinary. The work of master masons and carpenters and artisans who created something that was genuinely beautiful in many ways. That work deserves to be remembered and preserved if possible, but we must not let the architectural achievement obscure the moral horror of what Lynnewood Hall represents. It was built with money extracted from workers who had no choice but to accept whatever wages and conditions Widener offered. It was built with profits from monopolies that exploited public need for transportation. It was built with wealth accumulated through political corruption and the capture of regulatory systems. It was built by a man who opposed child labor laws and crushed unions and fought against every reform that might have given working people a better life. The beauty of the building cannot redeem the ugliness of its origins. This is the essential darkness of Lynnewood Hall and of all the great Gilded Age mansions. They were built to glorify men who should not be glorified, to celebrate fortunes that should not be celebrated, to create a sense of permanence for a social order that deserved to be overthrown. They were meant to stand as evidence that the men who built them had conquered their world, had achieved something lasting and significant. But what they actually evidence is the human capacity for self-deception, for believing that wealth justifies itself, for confusing the accumulation of money with the creation of value. Peter Widener died believing he had achieved something great. He left behind a mansion that was the largest private residence in America at the time, an art collection that enhanced one of the nation's greatest museums, a fortune that secured his descendants for generations. He left behind his name on buildings and institutions. He left behind a reputation as a great man of his era. But what he actually left behind was a record of exploitation, of workers crushed under the machinery of his ambition, of children who died in his coal mines, of families who went hungry while paying his streetcar fares, of a system of wealth and power that enriched the few at the expense of the many. The workers who built Lynnewood Hall left nothing behind except the building itself. We do not know most of their names, do not have records of their lives, cannot tell their individual stories. They were stonemasons and carpenters and laborers, immigrants and sons of immigrants, men who worked with their hands to create something magnificent for someone else's benefit. They went home each night to modest houses in Philadelphia's working-class neighborhoods, ate simple meals, raised their children as best they could on wages that barely covered necessities. Some of them may have been injured during the construction, may have fallen from scaffolding, or been crushed by falling stone. Some may have developed respiratory diseases from years of breathing stone dust and paint fumes. Some may have been fired for trying to organize their fellow workers or for refusing to work in unsafe conditions. These men created Lynnewood Hall just as much as Peter Widener did, arguably more so because they actually did the work of building it. But they owned none of it, benefited from none of it except their wages, left no mark on it except their anonymous labor. This is the fundamental injustice that Lynnewood Hall embodies. The stark inequality between those who own and those who work, between those who profit and those who produce. The mansion stands or falls as a monument not to Widener alone but to this relationship, this imbalance, this system that extracts wealth from the many to concentrate it in the hands of the few. As Lynnewood Hall continues to decay, as water seeps through the roof and frost cracks the limestone and gravity pulls at unstable walls, there is a kind of justice in its deterioration, not justice for the workers who built it, because they received no benefit from its construction and received none from its destruction, but justice in the sense that the mansion's fate reveals the lie at its heart. Widener built Lynnewood Hall to last forever, to stand as permanent proof of his significance, but permanence is not something that wealth can buy. Everything decays, everything returns to dust eventually, and the greater the initial excess, the more dramatic the eventual fall. The irony is that the workers who Widener exploited, whose names we do not know and whose individual lives are lost to history, are in some sense more permanent than he is. They are permanent because exploitation is permanent, because the pattern they live through repeats itself generation after generation, because their story of labor and suffering and struggle for dignity is the story of most of humanity across most of history. Widener was an aberration, an outlier, a man whose extreme wealth made him unusual even in his own time. His story is interesting because it is exceptional, but it is not representative. The representative story is that of the unnamed workers, and their story continues. Today, construction workers still build enormous houses for wealthy clients, still labor under conditions that are often difficult and sometimes dangerous, still take home wages that barely allow them to maintain their own modest homes. Coal miners still descend into darkness, though fewer of them now as the industry declines, still risk their lives and health to extract energy for a world that often seems indifferent to their welfare. Transit workers still operate the systems that move urban populations, still face pressure to work longer hours for less pay, still fight for basic dignity and respect in their labor. The pattern continues. The names and details change, but the fundamental dynamic remains. And Lynnewood Hall stands as a reminder of where that dynamic leads when it is allowed to operate without constraint. The question facing any society that allows extreme wealth concentration is what to do with the monuments that wealth creates. Do we preserve them as historical artifacts, as evidence of the social systems that produced them? Do we repurpose them for uses that might redeem their origins, turning palaces into hospitals or schools or museums? Do we allow them to decay naturally, letting time and entropy take their course? Or do we actively demolish them, erasing the physical traces of eras we wish to move beyond? There is no simple answer to these questions because monuments are complicated things. They are simultaneously historical documents and active participants in shaping how we understand history. Lynnewood Hall tells us something true and important about Gilded Age America, about the scale of wealth that was accumulated and the uses to which it was put. Visiting the house, even in its current deteriorated state, gives a visceral sense of the inequality of that era that no statistics or written descriptions can quite convey. There is pedagogical value in preserving it for that reason. But preservation also risks celebrating what should not be celebrated, risks normalizing extreme wealth concentration by treating its monuments as mere architectural achievements. If Lynnewood Hall were restored and opened as a museum, visitors might leave with a sense of wonder at the craftsmanship and scale, might think of Widener as a great collector and patron of the arts. It might miss entirely the human cost of what they are seeing. The contextualization would have to be extraordinary, would have to consistently foreground the exploitation and suffering that made the mansion possible. And even then many visitors would likely miss the point or choose to ignore it. The current state of Lynnewood Hall, abandoned and decaying, perhaps tells the truest story. It shows that even the greatest wealth and power cannot prevent eventual decline, that mansions built to last forever do not last, that the permanence that Widener sought was always illusory. The decay is a kind of honesty, a stripping away of pretense, a revelation of what remains when the gilding fades and the glory dims. What remains is stone and wood and steel, materials taken from the earth and shaped by human labor, and even these are slowly returning to disorder, slowly being reclaimed by entropy and time. But we should not romanticize the decay either, should not pretend that there is something beautiful or poetic about a magnificent building rotting away. The decay of Lynnewood Hall represents a failure of social imagination, an inability to find productive uses for the physical remnants of problematic eras. The house is disappearing not because we have collectively decided it should disappear, but because no one has been willing or able to take on the enormous cost and complexity of preserving it. This is not moral clarity but drift, not justice but neglect. What would a truly just resolution for Lynnewood Hall look like? Perhaps it would involve restoration but with radical repurposing, turning the mansion into something that serves the descendants of the workers who built it. Imagine Lynnewood Hall as a union headquarters, as affordable housing, as a community center for the working-class neighborhoods of Philadelphia. Imagine the ballroom where Widener held his exclusive parties converted into a space for worker organizing and labor education. Imagine the art gallery, Once it held paintings Widener purchased with profits from exploitation, converted into a museum telling the story of coal miners and streetcar workers and immigrant laborers who built industrial America. Imagine the library, once it held Widener's rare book collection, converted into a public library serving communities that lack adequate library services. This kind of repurposing would be expensive and difficult, would require vision and commitment and substantial resources. It would require overcoming the technical challenges of adapting a structure built for one purpose to serve very different functions. It would require political will and public funding that may not exist, but it would transform Lynnewood Hall from a monument to exploitation into something that might actually honor the memory of those who were exploited, would turn a symbol of injustice into an instrument of justice, however partial and imperfect. Short of such radical repurposing, the best we can probably hope for is careful preservation with honest contextualization, maintaining Lynnewood Hall as a historical site where visitors can learn not just about architecture and art, but about the social systems that made such architecture and art possible. Every room should include information not just about furnishings and design, but about the sources of Widener's wealth. The art gallery should display not paintings, which are long gone, but photographs of the workers whose labor paid for those paintings. The ballroom should echo not with orchestras but with recorded testimonies of workers describing their conditions and struggles. The library should hold not rare books but documents recording labor organizing efforts, strike testimonies, investigations into child labor and industrial accidents. This kind of contextualization would make Lynnewood Hall uncomfortable to visit, would prevent it from being simply a pleasant architectural tour, would force visitors to confront difficult truths about how wealth was and is accumulated in America. But that discomfort would be appropriate, would be necessary, would be the minimum requirement for honestly engaging with the site's history. The broader lesson of Lynnewood Hall extends far beyond one mansion in Pennsylvania. It is a lesson about the relationship between wealth and morality, about the limits of what money can achieve, about the price that societies pay when they allow unlimited accumulation of private fortunes. Every society has to decide what level of inequality it will tolerate, what constraints it will place on wealth accumulation, what obligations it will impose on those who benefit most from the economic system. The Gilded Age made certain choices, allowing men like Widener to accumulate fortunes through monopoly and exploitation, imposing minimal constraints on their behavior, asking almost nothing of them in return, except that they spend their wealth in ways that demonstrated proper taste. Those choices produced Lynnewood Hall and dozens of mansions like it, monuments to excess that briefly seemed magnificent but ultimately proved unsustainable. The choices also produced enormous human suffering, generations of workers who lived in poverty despite their labor, families torn apart by industrial accidents and disease, communities scarred by environmental damage from extractive industries, a democratic system corrupted by the political power of concentrated wealth. The mansions are footnotes to these larger stories, physical symbols of a moral failure. Contemporary America faces similar choices. We are living through a new Gilded Age in many respects, with wealth concentration returning to levels not seen since Widener's time. Tech billionaires and financial executives accumulate fortunes that would have dazzled even the robber barons. Billions and tens of billions of dollars concentrated in individual hands. They build enormous houses, purchase fleets of vehicles and aircraft, acquire art collections and sports teams and media companies. They establish foundations and give to charity, laundering their reputations through philanthropy, just as Widener did with his art donations. And they fight against progressive taxation and labor organizing and financial regulation, using the same arguments that Widener used, funding the same kinds of political operations. The question is whether we will repeat the mistakes of the Gilded Age or learn from them. Will we allow unlimited wealth concentration on the theory that it reflects merit and drives economic growth? Or will we recognize that extreme wealth is never earned in isolation, that it always depends on social institutions and infrastructure and the labor of countless workers, and that society therefore has a legitimate claim to constrain and tax such wealth? Will we allow the wealthy to build monuments to themselves while workers struggle to afford housing and healthcare? Or will we insist on a more equitable distribution of prosperity, on systems that ensure basic dignity and security for everyone? These are not easy questions, and there are genuine policy challenges in addressing them. Taxation systems can be evaded through sophisticated financial engineering. Regulation can stifle innovation and economic growth if poorly designed. International competition creates pressures to maintain favorable treatment of capital and high earners. But these challenges are not reasons to accept the status quo. They are problems to solve, obstacles to overcome in the process of creating a more just economic system. The story of Lynnewood Hall should inform these debates. It should remind us that extreme wealth concentration is not sustainable, that the monuments it builds eventually crumble, that the social systems it depends on eventually change. It should remind us of the human cost of wealth accumulated through exploitation, of the workers who build the mansions but can never afford to live in them, of the children who labor in dangerous conditions so that someone else can collect rare paintings. It should remind us that wealth does not confer wisdom or virtue, that being good at making money does not make someone good at governing society, that we should be skeptical of arguments that the wealthy deserve deference and gratitude. Most importantly, the story of Lynnewood Hall should remind us that history judges Peter Widener died thinking he had achieved greatness. But history remembers him primarily as an exploiter, a monopolist, a man who built his fortune on the suffering of others. His mansion, which was supposed to establish his immortal significance, instead stands as evidence of his moral bankruptcy. The art collection that was supposed to redeem his reputation cannot erase the origin of his wealth. The libraries and institutions that bear his name are monuments not to his generosity but to his guilt, attempts to purchase absolution that ultimately failed. Future generations will judge our era the same way. They will look at the decisions we make about wealth and power, about how we organize our economy and treat our workers, about what levels of inequality we accept and what we oppose. They will see the mansions being built today and will ask the same questions we ask about Lynnewood Hall. How were these fortunes made? What was the human cost? What obligations did the wealthy meet or should? What kind of society allowed such extremes? We cannot know what answers future generations will give to these questions, but we can influence them through the choices we make now, where we can choose to constrain wealth concentration through progressive taxation. We can choose to strengthen labor protections and support collective bargaining. We can choose to invest in public goods like education and healthcare and infrastructure, rather than allowing private accumulation to dominate. We can choose to preserve the monuments of previous eras not as celebrations but as warnings, as reminders of paths we should not follow again. Lynnewood Hall stands today. Still stands, though barely. Its limestone walls weathered and crumbling. Its interior spaces emptied of everything that made them magnificent. Its gardens returned to wilderness. It stands as an accusation and a warning, a reminder that wealth built on exploitation cannot sustain itself forever, that monuments to excess eventually decay, that justice, though slow, eventually arrives. The house is dying, has been dying for decades, will likely be gone within our lifetimes unless extraordinary efforts are made to preserve it. And perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps that is the ending the story deserves. A gradual return to dust in memory, a slow erasure of the physical traces of an era that should be remembered but not celebrated. But even if Lynnewood Hall disappears entirely, even if every stone is scattered and every timber has rotted away, the story it tells will remain. It will remain because it is fundamentally a human story, a story of ambition and greed, of labor and exploitation, of beauty and corruption, of permanence sought and impermanence found. It will remain because we keep repeating it, because every generation produces people who think they can accumulate unlimited wealth without moral consequence, who think they can build monuments that will outlast their own failures, who think that having money means being right. The story will remain until we finally learn its lesson, until we finally create an economic system that distributes prosperity more equitably, that values human dignity as much as capital accumulation, that recognizes that no one earns a fortune alone and therefore no one deserves to keep all of it. Until we create that system, mansions like Lynnewood Hall will keep being built and will keep decaying, and we will keep asking ourselves why we let it happen again on the end. The dark story of America's largest lost mansion is not mainly about architecture or even about one family's rise and fall. It is about all of us, about the choices we make as a society, about what we value and what we excuse, about who we celebrate and who we forget. Peter Widener built Lynnewood Hall to ensure he would never be forgotten, and in a sense he succeeded, but not in the way he imagined. He is remembered not as a great man but as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the corruption that accompanies concentrated power, the exploitation that underlies great fortunes, the emptiness at the heart of accumulated wealth. The mansion he built is disappearing, but the workers he exploited are somehow more present than ever. We see them in every construction site where people labor to build houses they will never own. We see them in every coal mine and factory where workers sacrifice their health for wages that barely sustain them. We see them in every transit system where employees face pressure to accept less while delivering more. We see them because their story never ended, because the pattern continues, because we have not yet built a world where everyone's labor is valued and everyone's dignity is respected. Lynnewood Hall is their monument as much as it is Widener, more than it is Widener's really, because they built it with their hands and their sweat and their years of life spent in his service. When it finally falls, when the last wall collapses and the last stone settles into rubble, it will be their work that is lost, their craftsmanship that disappears, their labor that returns to dust. For their story, the story of workers everywhere who build the world we live in and receive so little in return. That story continues. It continues in every person who gets up each day and goes to work knowing that someone else will profit from their labor. It continues in every family that struggles to make ends meet despite working full-time. It continues in every community that watches wealth flow upward while they are left behind. This is the dark story of America's largest lost mansion. Not dark because a building is decaying. Not dark because an art collection was dispersed. Not dark because a wealthy family's monument is fading. Dark because the mansion was built on suffering, because wealth concentration always requires exploitation, because we keep forgetting this truth and having to relearn it. Dark because Lynnewood Hall is not unique, because mansions like it keep being built, because we have not learned to value people over profit or labor over capital. Dark because the story is not over, because we are still living it, because the choices that created Lynnewood Hall are still being made every day by people who think this time will be different. But there is hope in the darkness. Hope in the fact that Lynnewood Hall is falling down, that Widener's dream of permanence is failing, that monuments to exploitation cannot stand forever. There is hope in the fact that we can learn from this history, that we can choose different paths, that every generation has the opportunity to create a more just society. There is hope in the workers who continue to organize and fight for dignity, in the movements for economic justice that refuse to accept inequality as inevitable, in the growing recognition that extreme wealth concentration is both morally wrong and practically unsustainable. Lynnewood Hall is dying, and we should let it die, not through neglect but through honest acknowledgement of what it represents. We should document it carefully, should preserve its story even as we allow the building itself to fade. We should use it to teach future generations about the Gilded Age, about the human cost of concentrated wealth, about the lies that men like Widener told themselves and others. We should make it a memorial not to Widener but to the workers who built it and the workers who suffered under his exploitation. And then, when it finally collapses into ruins, we should not rebuild it. We should let it stand as ruins, permanent ruins if possible. A reminder that empires fall and mansions crumble and wealth cannot buy immortality. In those ruins, in that collapse, in that return to dust, there is a kind of truth that the intact mansion could never express. There is honesty in decay, a stripping away of pretense, a revelation that all human works are temporary and all human pride is foolish. Peter Widener wanted Lynnewood Hall to last forever, to stand as proof of his significance. Instead it is disappearing, and in its disappearance it proves something he never intended. It proves that wealth is fleeting, that power is temporary, that the only things that last are the stories we tell and the choices we make. It proves that a mansion built on exploitation will eventually fall, that justice delayed is not justice denied, that time takes everything from everyone regardless of how much they accumulated. This is the lesson of Lynnewood Hall, the truth it tells in its decay. This is why its story matters, why we must not forget it even as the building itself fades. Because if we forget, we will repeat it. We will allow new Wideners to build new Lynnewood Halls. We'll allow wealth to concentrate until it becomes unbearable. We'll allow workers to be exploited until they rise up in desperation. We will watch new mansions built and will admire their beauty without asking about their cost. We will celebrate new fortunes without investigating their origins. We will accept new arguments that the wealthy deserve their wealth without examining whether that is true. Or we could remember. We could look at the ruins of Lynnewood Hall and see what they really are. A warning from the past, a message from a generation that made mistakes we do not have to repeat. We could choose differently, could build a society where wealth is more equitably distributed, where workers receive fair shares of the value they create, where no one lives in a palace while others struggle for basic necessities. We could create systems that prevent the kind of extreme concentration that produced Lynnewood Hall, that ensure everyone has dignity and security, that recognize our common humanity and mutual dependence. This is the choice that Lynnewood Hall presents to us, the question it asks across the years and through its decay. Will we learn from this history or repeat it? Will we remember the suffering that built the mansion or only admire the architecture? Will we value human dignity over accumulated wealth or will we allow exploitation to continue? The answer is up to us, to our generation and the ones that follow. The mansion is falling down, but the choice remains. What kind of society will we build? What monuments will we leave behind? What will future generations say about us when they walk through the ruins of our own era? These are the questions that matter. The questions that Lynnewood Hall forces us to confront if we engage honestly with its story. Not whether the building should be preserved, though that is worth debating, but whether we will preserve the values that allowed it to be built, whether we will continue accepting the exploitation it represents, whether we will learn from its decay or ignore the lessons it teaches. The story of Lynnewood Hall is not over because we are still writing it, still making the choices that will determine what it means. Every decision we make about wealth and power, about workers and owners, about justice and inequality, every such decision is part of this ongoing story. So let this be remembered. Let the dark story of America's largest lost mansion be told and retold until we finally understand what it means. Let us remember Peter Widener, not as a great man but as a warning. Let us remember Lynnewood Hall, not as a lost treasure but as a monument to injustice. Let us remember the workers who built it as heroes who deserved better than they received. Let us learn from this history. Let us choose differently. Let us build a world where such mansions are never needed because wealth is more equitably shared, where workers are honored rather than exploited, where human dignity matters More than capital accumulation. This is what the dying mansion teaches us if we are willing to learn. This is the meaning hidden in its decay, the truth emerging from its collapse. Lynnewood Hall is falling down, and in its fall it is teaching us how to stand up, how to build better, how to choose justice over greed. The question is whether we will listen, whether we will learn, whether we will finally create the world that the workers who built this mansion deserve to live in. Their labor created Lynnewood Hall, but our choices will determine what it means, what legacy it leaves, what lessons it teaches. May we choose wisely, may we choose justly, may we choose to honor their memory by building something better than monuments to exploitation. Thank you for watching The Dark Estate. If this story moved you or made you think differently about history and wealth, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the shadows of the past. Drop a like if you appreciate this kind of thorough historical investigation. And please comment below with your thoughts on Lynnewood Hall's story and its relevance today. Most importantly, tell us what dark history you want us to explore next. What forgotten mansion? What hidden scandal? What buried truth should we uncover in our next episode? Your suggestions guide our journey through history's darkest corridors. Until next time, remember that every grand facade hides a story, and sometimes those stories are darker than we ever imagined.